it's Ellie Masters, and I hope you're enjoying this free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance, all rolled into one.
JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. 51. Dungeon Take 2. Melissa. Melissa squeezed her eyes shut as Scott's roar of animalistic lust filled the air. But closing her eyes did nothing to keep the image of his bucking hips from her mind. While Pierce finished, Scott zipped his pants and then paced up and down the row of cages, reaching inside to touch the kneeling women, petting their heads and cupping their chins. She could only imagine what horrors he envisioned when he looked at them, and was thankful sturdy metal separated the women from the killer on the outside. Pierce groaned. His hands gripped the iron so hard his knuckles turned white. His head pressed against the bars as he huffed and seemed to sag. Silence descended for a time, except for heavy breathing coming from Pierce, but soon that evened out as he regained his composure. His body straightened. His fingers released their death grip on the bars and then moved to zip his fly. Pierce faced Scott, who knelt before one of the cages.
You like Cinderella?
Pierce's voice hitched.
I thought you wanted Goldilocks. I like them all,
Scott said with fascination.
How do you manage them?
Wonder filled Scott's expression as his gaze swept down the row of cages. Pierce's laugh filled the silence. It should have made her shiver, or brought on any string of nasty reactions, but the opposite occurred. Pierce's laughter was out of place. It was confident, sure, and slowed the drumbeat of her heart. He walked toward Scott, dragging his hand over the bars of the cages as he neared.
I just do. Are you ready for Goldilocks, or do you need a break? Or maybe you want to take care of your wife's punishment?
Ex-wife. She was Scott's ex-wife. Melissa's stomach clenched. Scott's gaze darted across the dungeon and locked on hers. Blackness darker than coal, measured, judged, and reduced her to insignificance. He waved a dismissive hand.
I'll get to her later.
He licked his lips.
Pierce
unlocked a cage and pulled out a woman. He stripped her of her clothing with an economy of effort which stunned Melissa, then led her to the wall beside the chained man. The woman shook but didn't resist. She even assisted the process and lifted her arms to be cuffed. He secured her wrists with handcuffs attached to eye bolts. Pierce stepped to the far end of the wall. Implements of torture hung in ordered rows, causing a shiver to work its way down her spine as she took in paddles, crops, floggers, whips, and worse. She clamped her teeth together, fighting against a whimper rising in the back of her throat. In stark contrast, the woman secured to the wall remained perfectly still and silent, resigned, perhaps, to what would happen next. Pierce selected a flogger. He swung it, testing its weight.
Nice,
Scott murmured.
But I thought you were going to fuck her. Oh, I am,
Pierce said.
But I enjoy it so much better when they scream.
Pierce pointed to the padded bench.
Why don't you have a seat? Watch for a bit, and when you're ready, let me know.
A twisted expression flashed across Scott's face. The throes of the flogger flying through the air filled the dungeon with a hiss. Its many tails swished as they went, then collided on flesh with a crack and a very definite scream. Tears slicked Melissa's face as the bound woman's cries reverberated in the air with a long, ear-piercing shriek.
Hey.
Scott pointed to the chained man.
You said no whips or canes for your girls, but what about him? I can do whatever I want to him, right?
Pierce glanced at the bound man. He had fallen silent while Scott and Pierce had pleasured themselves, but he struggled anew once the men's attention turned back to him.
I'm not willing to kill him.
Pierce drew back his arm and landed a nasty strike on the back of the woman's thighs. She screamed, her head thrown back, eyes staring at the ceiling, lungs emptying of air and filling the room with her pain. Melissa curled into a ball, seeking solace the only way she could.
Like it matters.
Scott grumbled.
I thought you didn't like men.
Pierce said with a tease in his voice.
I don't want to fuck him.
Scott's lips twisted.
But why can't I toy with him for a bit?
Pierce's eyes narrowed. He walked to the rows of implements and grabbed a flogger, thrusting it toward Scott.
Use this.
Scott looked at it, turning it over in his hands.
Heavy. I like it.
Silence. The terrific weight of the room was suffocating. Melissa hugged her knees to her chest, holding herself as tightly as she could. She couldn't bear watching the poor girl tortured. Hearing it was bad enough. The sound of a flogger whistled through the air, generating another scream, this one deep, masculine, and full of agony. Her eyes flew open and she silenced her cries, unwilling to draw unnecessary attention to herself. From the nearest cage, the woman motioned her to come to the edge of the bed. The cries of the bound woman masked the noise of her chains, as did the deeper timbre of the man's screams. The woman in the cage whispered so low that Melissa had to read her lips to make out what she was saying. "What is your name?" "Melissa." Her insides quivered. "We're not allowed to speak," she explained. "We'll be punished, but—" Melissa nodded, understanding the need to reach out in the face of this craziness. "Is your name Henrietta?" The woman's eyes widened. "How did you know?" She wiped away a tear. "People are looking for you." A light of hope shone in the woman's eyes. Melissa prayed her faith in CJ held out. "How long have you been here?" Henrietta blinked. "I don't know. A few days, maybe a week. It's hard to keep track of time down here." Her voice broke, and a choked sob escaped her lips. "Obey him. Do whatever he asks. If you don't, you're not the only one who will suffer. How do we get out of here?" Henrietta shook her head. "We don't. Some of these girls have been here for years." Melissa flinched each time a scream pierced the air, but it provided cover for their conversation. "I did this to myself." Henrietta's chin dropped to rest on her chin. She choked back a sob. "We're going to get out of here." CJ was out there, which meant there was hope. Male and female cries filled the dungeon, promising her a future of similar pain if CJ didn't hurry up with the hero business. But maybe she needed to figure something out on her own, in case CJ didn't make it in time.
52. The Cavalry. CJ. CJ gathered everyone and explained his conversation with Sam. Are we really going to do nothing? John asked. Fuck that, Brett said, slapping John's back. What's the plan, CJ? He glanced at Mac, who gave a nod. Mac would support him. Jenny stood with Charlie, the two women looking diminutive next to the men. Appearances were deceiving, however. He sparred against Jenny, and while he was still getting to know Charlie, he bet the pretty blonde held a few surprises. Everyone seemed eager to do something, but what? Sam's directive had been clear. He wasn't to enter the house. He clapped his hands together. All right. Brett and John, you're on recon. We need to know access points, vulnerabilities, water, power. He didn't have to go into excessive detail. Brett and John knew what kind of intelligence was required. Mac and Charlie, you take the yard and garage. Make sure there aren't any other entrances. Look for storm doors and basement entrances leading to the outside.
What does that leave for me?
Jenny turned to him, confused. You and I will explore the vacant lot next door. He wanted to be at the house, doing recon himself, but he was too vested in this operation. It was best to keep a bird's-eye view, stay away, and he needed Jenny to stop him if he did anything stupid.
Fine.
She twisted her face into a dissatisfied scowl. That lot makes my skin itch, he said in a flat tone. Only house in this entire development on a double lot. If he wanted privacy, his yard already butts up next to the forest. Why buy the lot next to him? It sticks out. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking out loud. We'll be spread thin. I'm okay with that, but we need to regroup in 10. We don't even know if Melissa's in there, or Henrietta for that matter. I need someone to get inside.
I'll do it.
Charlie flipped her bleach blonde hair.
If he's into kidnapping girls.
She made a suggestive gesture with her hands, emphasizing her curves.
Let's give him someone he wants to bring inside.
John pulled Charlie to him, wrapping an arm around her waist and tugging her close. No way in hell are you going in as bait. Brett stepped close, sandwiching her between him and John. Ditto. Charlie pressed her palm to John's chest and gazed into his eyes.
It's the best way to see what's inside, and we have tactical gear in the car. It'll be easy enough to get past the door, and I don't mind being bait.
I don't like it. John huffed. Brett twisted his lips, considering her proposal. Let's send Jenny in with her. CJ shook his head. Can't risk it. Jenny saw him at the bar, so we have to assume he's seen her. Charlie goes in alone. Charlie beamed. She rose to her toes and kissed Brett on the cheek.
I'll be fine.
She turned to CJ and put her hands on her hips.
We're doing this then?
Recon first, CJ insisted. Brett and John, you're on the exterior with Mac and Charlie. He shook his head. Sam was going to be pissed. I'll check out the empty field with Jenny. We meet back in 10 minutes, and if everything looks okay, Charlie goes in. I don't like it, John said, but he didn't argue against the plan. CJ didn't like it either. But if they could get Charlie inside for even a moment, it would make breaching the home that much more successful. It's up to you, he said, giving Charlie a chance to back out. She batted her eyelashes, doing a wonderful impression of a flirty co-ed. Then she unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her blouse, showing even more of her voluptuous cleavage.
I'm in,
she pronounced. Okay, he said. Let's do this. Brett and John jogged ahead of Mac and Charlie, leaving Jenny and CJ strolling on the sidewalk.
Sam confirmed Channing was a pen pal of Patterson?
Jenny asked. Yeah. She turned to face him, placing both hands on his shoulders.
Are you ready to face what we might find in there?
No. It wasn't the answer Jenny wanted to hear, but it was the truth. She wanted to know he'd established emotional distance, and that she could count on him. But that wasn't true. His insides screamed at him to rush inside that house, guns blazing, and save Melissa. It would be precisely the wrong thing to do, and more likely to get her killed. He knew this. Jenny knew this. Hell, Sam knew it too.
If this goes south, you can't kill him. I need you to promise you'll keep your cool.
He nodded, but he couldn't promise Jenny anything. He just found Melissa. And if he lost her before he explored whatever was happening between them, he'd be gutted for life. And if Scott Patterson was inside that house, little could stop him from putting the motherfucker down for good. He leveled a flat stare at Jenny. Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
You scare the living shit out of me sometimes.
As they skirted the outer edge of the property, his gaze cut to Brett and John ghosting around the outside of the house. Their movements were a study in economy of motion. In broad daylight, he wouldn't have seen them, except he knew to look for them. Mac and Charlie had stationed themselves outside one of the windows of the garage. Something had captured their attention. He veered toward them, only to be pulled away by a tug on his arm.
Keep to the plan,
she said. Their exploration of the vacant lot turned up nothing more than a manicured lawn, boulders too big to move, a culvert leading out of the rear of the property toward the tree line, a dirt road, and a large storm drain. A glance at his watch told him it was time to regroup with the others. Sam would arrive in less than an hour. CJ planned to be inside before then.
53. Her turn. Melissa. Melissa stopped flinching in response to the screams coming from the other end of the dungeon. When Scott grew bored whipping the hooded man, the poor man sagged against the metal cuffs. Blood seeped down his wrists. His back, his poor, tortured flesh, was a mass of raised welts and angry red lines. In contrast, Scott bounced on the balls of his feet, as if the whipping invigorated him. Pierce stepped away from the woman sobbing against the wall. Her back mirrored that of the man. Raised welts, red and angry, laced her skin. He guided her back to her cage, whispering praise. Melissa would have shed more tears if not for her ex-husband's cold, dark eyes staring at her.
I'm ready for her,
he said, pointing a finger. Pierce glanced over his shoulder, his magnetic gaze stealing her attention from Scott. With a nod, he came toward her. He reached for her, and it took all of her self-control not to flinch at his touch. She was surprised at the warmth of his skin and the gentleness of his touch when he cupped her chin.
Are you ready, my queen?
His throaty whisper made her breath hitch in her throat. She had to swallow before she could speak, dreading the words but knowing she had to play a role. It might be the only thing that saved her from Scott. Is this what you want, my king? His brow quirked at the use of his self-proclaimed title. She was hoping for a reaction, uncertain what she needed. She was figuring everything out as she went.
It's what must be done,
he said with remorse.
Only then can you be forgiven.
Melissa licked her lips. Her mouth had gone dry, and her lips seemed to want to stick together. She forced her gaze to drop just barely submissive, but not surrendered. At least, not yet. I'm terrified. The words cracked in her throat. His forehead furrowed as he leaned down.
It will be painful, but you will endure this punishment. Do you understand?
She took in a deep breath and let it out. Slowly, she allowed her gaze to travel up to meet his once again. I don't know if I'm strong enough.
I will be by your side, my queen.
He ran his thumb along her cheek, traced the angle of her jaw, and brought his finger to her lips.
Hey, are you gonna talk all night or what?
Scott's harsh words intruded on her moment with Pierce. She lost what little ground she had gained when Pierce startled at Scott's irritating words. Pierce shook his head. He pointed to the wall with the implements.
Use the light cane on the far left. I'll move her into position.
Her ability to keep still failed as a shiver worked its way down her spine, and nervous sweat made her hands clammy and cold. Her hips and knees ached from the prolonged flexion in the bindings, but that was nothing compared to the flare of agony in her shoulders. Pierce swept her into his arms and carried her without strain, unlike her husband, who struggled to hold her.
I will be with you the entire time, my queen.
His whispered words floated into her ears, said so low she imagined she heard them until he continued.
I will protect you. You must endure 10 strikes. Will you please me?
She needed to draw out his protective instinct, so she did the unthinkable. She gave him a nod. It was a calculated move, but what choice did she have? She could go with the evil she knew and die, or see where this secondary evil took her. Pierce was a collector of women, and unlike her husband, seemed to keep his playthings around. Years, if she were to believe what Henrietta had said. If it took years, Melissa would find her way free. As long as she was alive, she would fight. Don't leave me alone with him, she whispered and pressed her cheek against his shirt. Please, I can't do this alone. His breathing hitched, paused for a beat. A deep breath followed, and she imagined his chest swelled with pride. He kissed her forehead, and she struggled not to pull back from the intimate touch.
I will be with you, my queen. I will never leave you.
Thank you. She lifted her wrists, both hands rising together, bound as they were, and fluttered her fingertips against the buttons of his shirt. The walk from the bed to the padded bench ended, and with it, their short conversation died. Pierce became businesslike, almost robotic in his motions. He draped her face down over the bench. She flinched as pressure was put on her bruised ribs. He allowed her to reposition herself for comfort, an odd consideration in light of what was to come. Then he released her ankles from their bindings, but only to strap them down again, securing each ankle to a leg of the bench. The same treatment followed with her hands. Melissa's breathing turned ragged, as fear overrode her instinct for survival.
Do not fight, my queen. It will only make it worse.
Pierce placed a hand to her hip as he fastened a strap over her back.
Aren't you going to strip her?
Scott demanded. She hoped he would not. Her jeans were her last defense against the long rattan cane Scott would use.
I am not,
Pierce said. He came around to stand at her head, but she didn't lift to look at him. She couldn't. He knelt down, putting his head level with hers, forcing the issue with that movement. Melissa wriggled her hands. Pierce had secured them to the legs of the bench. She had to develop his trust. Please release my hands.
No.
She would not let that faze her. Please, my king. She winced as the title passed her lips, but it was necessary. She flipped the hair out of her eyes and focused on his chin and the set of his mouth. The strength to look into his eyes was beyond her. I need you to hold my hands while he does this. Begging her tormentor to comfort her during this crazed beating made no sense, but there was nothing about the entire situation that made sense. His jaw clenched. It was a tiny gesture, but it was enough. He spoke into her ear.
You must not flinch or jerk your hands from mine. You can injure yourself if you do. If you move your hands to protect yourself, you will be hurt.
She understood from personal experience, and her one and only experience with Scott and a cane. Only then she'd been alone. Now she had Pierce, and she would be damned if he wasn't going to help her survive this. Thank you. She also wasn't above begging. Melissa brought her gaze up to meet his, and met smoky darkness in their depths. It chilled her to her core to look upon such madness. He released her wrists and lifted her hands to his lips. One kiss to each knuckle. She held still the entire time. Behind them, Scott whipped the cane through the air as if testing its weight. She flinched with each swish, not knowing when the first blow would strike.
Whenever you're ready.
Pierce grabbed her hands, lacing his fingers with hers. The disdain in his voice was thinly veiled by the very real threat overlying it.
10 strikes. I got it,
Scott said.
10 isn't even a drop in the bucket for what she deserves, but knowing she'll never see the light of day again is punishment enough.
The cane whistled through the air, struck her flesh, and cut right to the bone. Screams flew from her mouth, and her hands clenched around Pierce's grip. He whispered into her ear, telling her to breathe, to take the pain, and coached her through that first strike.
Oh, that was perfect, my love,
Scott said. If she was to be free of this place, she needed Pierce to trust her and keep her unchained. Melissa gripped his hands tighter, moaned against the searing pain in her backside as she prepared for the second strike. It came sooner than she expected, and before she could brace herself, another scream ripped from her throat. All the while, Pierce told her to absorb the pain, breathe it in. She locked eyes with him and did as he commanded. Somehow the pain flowed through her to him, and she breathed past it. There was power in his gaze, and crazy energy flowed between them. He took her pain. Without him, she never would have survived 10 strikes from the cane. But she did survive, and that was all that mattered. When Pierce released her from the bench, he carried her back to the massive bed. He reached up and tugged on a chain hanging from the canopy above the bed. He kissed her lightly on the lips.
I am so proud of you, my queen.
He turned to Scott.
Let's head upstairs and refresh ourselves.
Scott sneered as he passed the bed.
She's a fucking bitch. Useless in bed, and you're welcome to her. I will claim her when we return, but we need to discuss your plans for leaving. Besides, it's dinner time and I'm hungry.
Scott's eyes widened.
I'm not done. I want to fuck some more. You have all night. No reason to rush. Besides, You'll be stronger after a meal, and I'm curious how you intend to leave town.
Pierce led Scott toward the dungeon door. He stooped over to unlock the set of 6 locks that secured them all inside. 6 locks. Melissa groaned as the door closed behind her kidnapper and ex-husband. Then she looked down and gasped. He'd left her hands unbound.
54. Into the lion's den. CJ. Movement at the house caught CJ's attention. Mac and Charlie ran away from the garage, heading toward the backyard. John vaulted over a bush into the neighbor's yard, followed by Brett. CJ grabbed Jenny, pulling her into a crouch. "Something's up," he said. It would be easier to walk back to the car along the sidewalk, but that would put them in view of the house and whoever was inside. The only reason his team would have bailed was if they had seen someone, which meant he and Jenny needed to take a detour to get back to the vehicles.
"At least we know someone's home,"
Jenny said. "Yes, and that means Melissa's probably there too."
"Let's wait to hear what the others found. Then we'll go in."
CJ stopped, floored by Jenny's comment. "What about Sam?"
"Like you would ever wait. Let's just not be stupid about it."
They circled the back of the lot and skirted behind the neighbors' yards, weaving in, over, and around the fences. When they made it to the vehicles, they were the last to arrive. "Report," CJ said. Charlie, John, and Brett snapped to attention at the command in his voice. Mac's grin greeted him. CJ was probably only 1 in 3 people in the world who would think the look on his face was anything but terrifying, but he knew Mac well. Charlie spoke first.
"The white van is parked in the garage. The back doors were open and there were red roses in the back and all over the floor."
"She's inside." Mac stared at CJ, not even trying to sugarcoat his words. He'd already guessed as much, but was glad to have it confirmed. John leaned against the black SUV. Not a sign of anyone at first. House looked empty. 3 bedrooms, only 1 with a bed. Back door leads off the kitchen, and other than the front door and the garage, the bedroom windows are the only other entry and exit points. Bedroom windows have security locks on the inside and are blocked with dowels. There were beer bottles on the counter in the kitchen, Brett added. At least 2. A door led down to the basement. I'm betting that's where he took her because we didn't see anyone in the house. Any sign of a second man? They had to remain open to the possibility Pierce Channing sheltered Scott Patterson within his home. Brett spoke. "I heard 2 voices but saw no one. I'm assuming they were headed up from the basement. We ditched before they could catch us, but definitely 2 male voices." "Damn," CJ said. Mac's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not good." "Not good at all." CJ looked at Charlie. "Did you get a look at them?" She shook her head.
"No. When John whistled, Mac and I hightailed it out of there."
"Anyone look at the yard? Any reason to think there's another entrance to that basement?" There'd been nothing in the vacant lot. No one said anything. It would affect planning, not knowing. Everyone understood this. CJ breathed out. "We're blind. It's risky." Mac nodded. Jenny's cell phone rang. She glanced at it.
"It's Sam."
"Tell him we're waiting."
"You want me to lie?"
"I want you to follow orders," CJ said.
"Yours or his?"
He rolled his eyes. "Just answer the fucking phone." She put the phone to her ear.
"Sam?"
Her gaze flicked to his.
"Yes, we're around the corner holding position. No, we haven't engaged. Yes, CJ's behaving."
There was a bit of back and forth between Sam and Jenny before she hung up.
"He believes me and says he's less than an hour out. And under no circumstances are you to engage."
"Okay." CJ turned to his team. "Now, who has suggestions for going in?" They tossed around several ideas, but settled on the only one that granted them access to the inside of the house. Charlie pulled a suitcase out of the back of John's car. She pulled her hair into a high ponytail, put on a pair of black running pants and a tank top which emphasized her cleavage. Brett whispered in her ear, the sound too low to make out, but by his tone, Brett was not pleased. In an uncharacteristic gesture, Charlie cupped Brett's cheek. She didn't kiss him, but there was definite tenderness in that touch.
"It'll be fine,"
she whispered. When she smiled, Brett's shoulders slumped. She twirled on the sidewalk.
"How do I look?"
"You look hot," Brett said. "Too hot." Mac shook his head and rummaged around in the back of his car, searching. "Here." He tossed earbuds and a small music player at Charlie, which she clipped on the inside of her bra. "Don't lose them," he warned. Jenny put a hand on his shoulder.
"She'll be fine."
She turned to Charlie.
"If they invite you inside, tell us what you see. Stay only a couple minutes. Get in and get out."
John opened the back door of his car. He sat with a computer in his lap, typing away. A few minutes later, he pulled a piece of paper off the portable printer and handed it with a clipboard to Charlie. "Your ticket in," he said. "You're asking for donations to a women's shelter. It's your sorority's charitable work this semester. As capable as Charlie seemed, it would be 2 against 1 on the inside if things went down. We need to get a visual on the basement," he said. "See if you can get down there and give us a report. Mac and I will slip in the kitchen door and get in position." Jenny shook her head.
"Not a good plan."
She pointed at him.
"Channing knows what you and Mac look like. If he sees even a hint of you, it's all over."
Her finger shifted to Brett and John.
"Let them go. If they get caught, play it off as a fraternity prank."
"Sounds reasonable," CJ admitted, although he wanted closer to the action. Briefly, he wondered if this was how Sam felt, always sending in the others to do the work. "All right," he said as he clapped his hands together. "Charlie will work her magic and get inside." He turned to her, his tone turning serious. "You know who you're dealing with, and what these men are capable of. You need to be on guard."
"I got it, boss."
She cupped her breasts and glanced down.
"Let's see if these perky boobs are worth their weight in gold."
She gave him a wink.
"Oh, honey."
Jenny said with a laugh.
"You're too much."
CJ motioned for Brett and John to follow Charlie at a discreet distance, while he, Mac, and Jenny hung back. As Charlie walked away, Mac cycled through radio checks. To the men inside, it would look like she was listening to her music, but the sophisticated technology inside the player allowed full two-way communication. Sam would skin CJ alive once he found out what he was doing. But he couldn't wait. He had a team of 6 skilled operatives who were well trained in hostage rescue, and 2 women to save.
55. Chains. Melissa. The door squeaked closed, and the last Melissa heard of the men were locks snapping into place and the low rumble of their conversation. She was trapped. Panic set in, claustrophobia hemming her in from all sides. She was in a tomb of stone, rock, and timber supports. Desperate for air, she clawed at her throat. No way out. No way to get to the locks. Exploring her injuries kept her mind from the oppressiveness of the earth overhead, and despite her fears, she could breathe. There had to be a ventilation shaft. A grab for the bedpost had her jerking in surprise. Her arms and legs were free. Had it been intentional? An oversight? She reached for the collar latched around her throat and felt for the lock. It seemed a simple keyhole and not one of the combinations Pierce seemed so fond of using everywhere else. Melissa blew out a calming breath. The action distracted her from the room, from the locked door, and from the overwhelming sense of being buried alive. No ventilation shaft, but there was ductwork plumbed into the ceiling. What kind of perverted mind thought all this up? A man who left women inside cages, that's who. Some wept, some slept. Gretel had yet to move. None spoke, and she wondered why, but then remembered Henrietta's warning. Her gaze traveled to the woman in the nearest cage. Henrietta rocked back and forth, her lips mumbling something Melissa couldn't make out. She yearned to comfort her, as Henrietta had done for her, but a glance told her now was not the time. The chain attached to the collar bound Melissa to the bedpost and limited her movement. Fortunately, Pierce had missed something. She pulled out a bobby pin from her hair. This wasn't something she had ever tried before, and it would be much harder than it looked in the movies, but she had to try. She felt at the keyhole of the lock. Inserting the bobby pin was easy. Now what? She felt around. Something was inside, a latch or mechanism, but she couldn't get the bobby pin to grab it, push it, pull on it, or slide it to the side. After several long minutes, what seemed like hours, she was afraid the men would be back any moment. Tears of frustration streamed down her cheeks. "What are you doing?" Henrietta whispered. Melissa's head shot up, surprised by the sudden noise in the eerie silence of the dungeon. Henrietta had moved to the front of her cage, her fingers clutched at the metal bars. "I'm trying to get this off." "Do you know what you're doing?" Henrietta's eyes flicked to the dungeon door and back to Melissa. "No, it seems so easy on TV." With a shake of her head, Melissa dropped her hands from the frustrating task. Henrietta smiled. "Television makes things seem easy, but there's a trick to it." "You know how to pick a lock?" Melissa widened her eyes, first with surprise and then with interest. The woman nodded. "My husband taught me, God rest his soul. He was into picking locks." "Do you think you could?" Hope bloomed in her chest. Henrietta shrugged. "Why? When he comes back, he'll only punish you, and me for helping, and then the others while I watch. It's my job to watch over them." "Watch over them?" She shook her head. "Yes. In this crazy world, I'm the fairy godmother." She pointed to the other cages. "Everyone here is a princess for that demented jerk." She pointed to each of the women, saying their names. "He punished Gretel because of me. I don't know if she'll make it. It's why he brought the nurse down. The others are Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Goldilocks, and Belle." She pointed to Belle's cage, furthest from them both, and closest to the man. The woman was curled up on the floor, sleeping. "There's something not right with Belle. She adores Prince Charming." "You mean Pierce Channing?" "No, Prince Charming. That's what we're supposed to call him, except you're special. He was getting off when you called him king. Be very careful. You're not the only one who will get hurt when he gets mad." Henrietta's entire body shuddered. Melissa firmed her lips into a determined line. "I know you've been down here a while, and I don't understand what he's put you through, but I'm not ready to give up. Besides, someone's looking for me." CJ wouldn't stop until he found her. She believed that with every ounce of conviction she could muster. "I'll do whatever I can to make it as easy on him to rescue me." Even if she had to save herself. Melissa had been tormented by Scott for 6 years. She wouldn't become a victim to Pierce. Henrietta coughed. "I'm glad you have hope. I tried." Her gaze traveled to the wall. "He's here because of me." "The man?" "He's a nurse. Our prince." Henrietta's mouth twisted around the title with distaste. "Your king brought that man to take care of Gretel." "What happened to her?" Henrietta explained the knives, and Melissa's stomach twisted with the horrific images. It was all she could do not to get violently ill. "So you see," Henrietta concluded, "I'm hesitant to do anything to make him mad. I don't know what else he's capable of, but now that other one is here." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm scared. I think none of us are getting out of this alive." Melissa wasn't ready to believe that, even if she feared it might be true. "Which is why you need to help me," she insisted. "No." With great difficulty and no small amount of pain due to the recent caning, Melissa moved to the foot of the bed. The chain moved with her, tracking over one of the cross beams of the 4-poster bed. "I think I can reach you," she said. "I don't know." Henrietta worried her lower lip between her teeth. "We have to try," Melissa insisted. She scooted off the bed and stepped to the corner of Henrietta's cage. The chain tying her to the bed barely reached. Henrietta took the bobby pin from Melissa's hand, and Melissa feared she would toss it to the ground for a moment. The woman's hands shook, and her gaze kept cutting to the sleeping Belle. "I haven't done this in years." A tremor of fear laced her voice, but she pulled open the bobby pin and fashioned it into a hook. "Lean close." Melissa moved as far forward as she could. finding the limits of the chain when her neck came a few inches from the bars of Henrietta's cage. Henrietta reached through and grabbed hold of the collar in one hand. She inserted the bobby pin in the lock and fished around, poking and probing the inner mechanism. Melissa kept her voice to a low whisper. "You warned me about Belle, but what about the others?" "Oh, Belle is crazy. Don't trust her. She wants to be down here, and I wouldn't count on the others either. They've been here a long time from what little I can gather. He's great at instilling fear and turning it into an impulse to please. Trust me, I know." Henrietta's fingers rattled, scraping the bobby pin against the metal of the collar. "What about the man?" Henrietta pursed her lips. "He's a fighter, but I'm afraid for him." Melissa sighed. "You said there's no way out of here?" "Only that door. There has to be another way. A man like Pierce seems too obsessive to leave himself only one way out. Have you noticed any drafts?" "Drafts?" She bit her lower lip as she worked, her brows furrowed with concentration. "You know, evidence of another exit. The tunnel coming down here was elaborate. I'm betting there's another way out." "I don't know." Snick. "You did it!" Melissa gasped as the lock opened. She unfastened the collar and threw it away with disgust. The leather swung in an arc dangling from its chain. She felt her throat and reached for Henrietta's hands. The contact of soft, warm flesh soothed her nerves, giving her strength. "Now, how do I get you out of this cage?" She moved to the bars at the front and looked at the combination lock on the door. Her eyes lifted, widening with alarm to meet Henrietta's. "What do I do?" Henrietta's breath stuttered out of her chest. "I know the first number is 6, and the last is 4 or 5, but I could never see the middle numbers." It amazed her the woman had seen any of the numbers at all. Talk about paying attention to details. "You're brilliant." She crouched down and set the first tumbler to 6 and the last to 4. She moved the middle 2 dials around, moving from 00 to 99, but nothing happened. "It's not working," Henrietta said with a moan. "Give me a chance." Melissa turned the last dial to 5 and tried again. Nothing. She pressed her lips together, concentrating as she reset the tumblers and moved the dials again. The lock refused to budge. She leaned back and looked up at Henrietta. "Are you certain you saw the right numbers?" "I thought so. I made myself pay attention no matter how scared I was. He always unlocks the cage and leaves the lock hanging. It makes it easier for him to lock us back inside when he's through with us." God. Melissa didn't even want to think about that. "I'm certain." "But not about the last number?" "I only saw it once, and I think he bumped it when he dragged me out. I remember him having to turn it one turn." "Maybe it was a 3? Melissa set to the task again, turning the last tumbler to 3, but nothing budged. Her eyes glanced to the dungeon door. She didn't know how long the men would be gone. When she looked back at the locks, her eyes caught the numbers, and her breath hitched in her throat. "Oh my," she said with rising excitement. Her hands trembled as she turned the first tumbler. "What are you doing? I know for sure that was a 6. She thumbed the dial to number 9. "I believe you, but Henrietta, you were looking at it from the top. The numbers were upside down to you." She turned the third tumbler back to 4 and then moved the dials. The lock opened with a solid clunk when she reached 21. "You did it!" Henrietta exclaimed. Her hands flew to her chest, her fingers entwined, and she kissed her knuckles as if giving thanks to a prayer answered. "Oh my!" Wide, frightened eyes glanced at Melissa. "Now what?" "We help him." Melissa pointed to the man chained to the wall. She glanced at the wall of implements and suppressed a shudder. "Then we arm ourselves. 3 against 2? Maybe we can get some of the others to help?" Henrietta shook her head. "No, they won't help. Or if they do, it won't be us they're helping. I'm telling you, he has them brainwashed." Her attention turned to the rows of cages. Belle, the one who seemed most devoted to Pierce, slept quietly. Melissa had seen the crazed look in the woman's eyes and trusted Henrietta, but she wasn't sure about the others. She removed the lock and opened the door to Henrietta's cage. The 2 women exchanged a hug. "I'm terrified," Henrietta admitted. "Me too," Melissa said. "Come." She headed to the wall. The man stilled as they approached. His head lifted. The gag in his mouth kept him silent. Melissa strode toward him, determined to remove the hood and the evil gag. "My name is Melissa." Henrietta moved to the side wall. Melissa cocked her head and gave Henrietta a questioning look. "There's a mechanism in the wall that holds the chains. I've watched him use it." Henrietta opened a wooden panel and reached inside. Henrietta struggled with something, but Melissa turned her attention back to the man and watched his deep, painful breaths. She unfastened the gag, helping to guide it out of his mouth as he struggled. She could only imagine the strain the gag had placed on his jaw. The hood was wet from the saliva dripping out of his mouth, an effect of the gag. He said nothing, working his jaw in slow circles. She reached around the back of his head and undid the buckles securing the hood in place. "I almost have it," Henrietta's voice pinched with strain. "Why is this so hard?" Melissa pulled the hood off and stared. "Charles? Oh my God! Charles?" "I got it!" Henrietta squealed in victory. The thick chains rattled as whatever had held them in place released. The man crumpled to the floor, leaving Melissa holding a black hood. Charles glanced up. "What happened to you?" Melissa couldn't believe her eyes and dropped to wrap her arms around his tortured body. Tears streamed down her cheeks.
"Miss Evans,"
he croaked. "Can you move?" So many questions flashed through her mind. She stroked his head, combing back his sweat-soaked hair. He flexed his shoulders and groaned.
"Give me a moment."
His breath hissed between his teeth, cueing her into the tremendous pain he must be in. "You know him?" Henrietta knelt beside him. "He was my nurse." "What are the odds?" Charles struggled to move.
"I can't feel my arms, and my legs are asleep."
"Let me rub them," Melissa said. "It will help with the circulation." He shook his head.
"No. Who knows when those two will be back. Go."
His chin jerked toward the wall with the implements.
"Grab something. Get ready for when they return."
"We can't take them alone." Melissa examined the cuffs around his right wrist and pulled on the straps. "We're in luck," she pointed. "I can pick these locks." After freeing him of the wrist cuffs, she turned her attention to his ankles. They worked on unfastening the cuffs. "You rest. Let the circulation return to your arms and legs." She tossed the cuffs to the side and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry." He gave her an odd look.
"For what? I did this to myself. I thought it was—"
Charles hung his head.
"Never mind. This isn't your fault."
She didn't believe him. What were the chances her nurse had been picked by the man who had been planning her kidnapping?
"I need a moment,"
Charles said through a mask of pain. He might be free of his restraints, but she was afraid Henrietta was right. He wouldn't be much use when the men returned. She hurried over to the wall and joined Henrietta before the rows of implements. Henrietta held a thick rod in one hand and a whip in the other. She turned to Melissa. "I don't know which one is better." "Take both," she said. "I'm going for a cane because I know I can use it. I've never used one of those whips before. I don't think I'd cause any damage with it." Henrietta snapped the whip and it cracked in the air. "I've seen him use it often enough." She held it out to Melissa. "Take both. We'll hit him with the canes, and if that doesn't work, we'll whip them." She pulled a third cane and a thick wooden paddle from the wall. "These are for Charles." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Let's hope he recovers enough to use them. So what's our plan?" Melissa waved her chosen cane in the air. It felt weird, almost too light to do any real damage, but she knew from experience how crippling it could be and how much it hurt. She went to the door. "We wait. Ambush them when they come back. With all those locks, we should have plenty of notice."
Hello, this is Ellie Masters, and I have to say that when I was writing these past few scenes, I was on the edge of my seat. I could feel my heart racing as I was trying to figure out how Melissa and Henrietta were going to save themselves from this. And we're getting close. We're about 10 chapters away from the end of this, so another 2 installments. and it's all nonstop from here, nonstop action and wonderful, wonderful stuff. Thank you for hanging in there so long with me, and give me another couple of weeks and we can get through this story together. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.